DICE released a blog post yesterday that detailed the future, or lack thereof, of Battlefield 5, which at first read is so vague and cryptic with how the statement is written, but later clarified by the official Battlefield Twitter and Instagram, spelling it out explicitly, which is fitting that even on an announcement that details the end of life for Battlefield 5, that DICE even botched the fucking announcement so badly, with the April update being pushed back into May due to COVID-19 and having no more content updates after the one in June, for which there is no additional chapter after the current one. It marks the end of the constant uphill battle that had always seemed insurmountable for the DICE team, trying to right all of the wrongs that they themselves injected, both into the core game itself and through its live service buzzword excuse to ship an empty shell of a product. Let me be clear, I enjoy playing Battlefield 5 as a game, but DICE constantly shooting itself in the foot really destroyed any chance that this game had, beginning before the game even launched, and it continued to do so by botching the live service when they wrote checks that their ass couldn't cash by overpromising and under-delivering in nearly every facet of the game. Let's first start with the reveal show in May of 2018 that culminated in a trailer which was not well received, with characters that had crazy cosmetics, and the only gunplay that was shown was a soldier squirming all over the ground shooting at shit. It was a complete contradiction from the game that they had just talked about for the previous 20 minutes. Given that the last World War II Battlefield game was 1943, released in 2009 on a completely different game engine, fans were expecting something radically different than what was shown for this game. Instead of iconic battles and a gritty World War II atmosphere on the beautiful Frostbite engine, Battlefield 5 went for the lesser-known battles and untold stories route, which obviously isn't going to get the same fanfare and popularity because of a more niche scope, but it still had the potential to be a great game, to have a new experience in the World War II setting instead of regurgitating the same old shit that we played for years on end now. Remember the oversaturation of World War II FPS games, anybody? Battlefield 5 was already starting off on the wrong foot, but then came time to playtest the game, and then it became evident that the reveal trailer didn't represent the game that we played during the alpha and beta at all. When I played the first closed alpha, the game was much more tactical, with attrition being a really huge game mechanic because of how little ammo you'd receive upon spawning and the lack of any health regen except below 30 HP until only that threshold, which meant an emphasis on squad play to help out one another refill health and ammo, as well as the fortification system building the supply stations to replenish those items, and the gunplay being very crisp and having a faster time to kill than in previous Battlefield titles. Then the beta came out, which was available to all, and dialed back the attrition mechanic by giving a medical pouch to everybody upon spawn, which could be refilled from medics, allowing people to heal whenever the fuck they please, and upping the starting ammo count. Then when the game finally launched, those aforementioned resupply stations were already built when the game started at objectives, thus reducing the importance of both squad play and fortifications, which the latter mechanic really never came into its own, even after the fortifications build speed was increased drastically in a patch almost a year later, because the scope and areas of which you could build fortifications was so restricted to just surrounding objectives. The former, squad work, took another hit about 5 months later in April when DICE decided to add features to grab health and ammo from other players a la Battlefield Hardline to make them passive helpers, which also undercuts the attrition mechanic as well due to the greater ease of supplies, in spite of the fact that I actually really like the idea of helping yourself to ammo and health, because sometimes you get set up with fucking window lickers on your team, but it does run contradictory to their design philosophy of the game. With attrition, an idea that may have been good on paper was actually terrible in principle because it doesn't appeal to a large common denominator of Battlefield fans and played poorly when put into practice, especially at the extreme levels of the first closed alpha, which just shows you how disconnected DICE was from their audience even in the early stages of the game. I mean, who the fuck playtested the alpha builds and thought that level of attrition was a good idea? They finally got it right around the launch of the game, but then went too far in subsequent patches and continued to further distance itself from this core tenet to a point where it didn't even matter anymore when playing the game because ammo and health weren't that scarce at all anymore. The ever-evolving core vision of what the game was supposed to be is evident in the fact that there are 139 fucking pages of patch notes for the changes at the launch day patch, but the one consistent thing that almost all players universally agreed upon was that the gunplay was the best part of the game. For DICE to change it in December of 2018, only 1 month after the game launched with a quick hotfix without warning, just shows you that they have no idea what makes their game enjoyable to play. Eventually it was reverted a week later after the community gave their feedback via playing on a side-by-side comparison comparison with 2 different playlists. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, as if they had goddamn amnesia, DICE pushed the infamous 5.2 update that, among other terrible ideas, made yet another time to kill change that again upended the way that the game had been played for 13 months prior at that point in terms of weapon balance to have a longer time to kill. This was accompanied by even further distancing itself from the attrition mechanic by giving all players extra magazines, since of course now it takes longer to kill, and they even went so far as changing recoil patterns to make them easier to control so that the increased number of bullets to kill doesn't seem like such a feat if weapons are easier to maintain fire with. This also meant that the recoil patterns that were ingrained into the muscle memory of Battlefield players for over a year now were just completely obliterated, and it made everything so much easier across the board to control, which meant that the weapons felt devoid of any unique characteristics. It wasn't until 3.5 months later in March of 2020 that update 6.2 finally reverted most of the 5.2 update, and it actually achieved the initial goal of only changing the time to kill at longer distances, which is what DICE should have just done in the first place. So for that extremely long period of time, the universally lauded Gunplay went to shit, and DICE was so stubborn about reverting it that even though they eventually crawled back to that weapon balance that I talked about, they refused to admit it was a revert, but rather a revision of the time to kill. This is how fucking arrogant the development team is, and it shouldn't be such a surprise. This is the same development team, after all, that had a hashtag everyone's Battlefield launch party where they mocked and ridiculed people that didn't agree with their vision of the game because employees felt that their shit didn't stink. Albeit there definitely is a portion of the community that deserves to be pointed and laughed at for their toxic behavior, but it just shows you how the team at DICE had no idea how to handle their own product against what the people that were actually supporting the game wanted from it. Another core gameplay mechanic was the lack of 3D spotting, opting instead for area spots by relegating 3D spotting only to a handful of instances, which is suppressive fire or a recon trait or one of 2 recon gadgets. But in that infamous 5.2 update, that entire system was turned upside down with a passive spotting feature, meaning that you didn't even have to be shooting at, or in some cases even aimed at, a soldier for their enemy icon to show, as well as HUD indicators when you yourself were spotted to easily know that, hey, there's a flare to go shoot down. This again reeks of the developers not knowing what did and didn't work in their game. Not to mention, soldier visibility had been a huge issue from day one due to a horrific dynamic lighting system in the game, the ability to customize your soldiers so that it's almost impossible to tell friendly from enemy apart, with skins that make players blend into the background. Numerous attempts were made, including changes to lighting sources, having goddamn auras around soldiers like you're fucking experiencing vertigo, and cleaning up the maps to have not so many camping issues. But when you design multiple classes of weapons a la MMGs and anti-tank rifles that can only be fired when mounted or prone to further encourage players to blend into their surroundings, you're gonna have this problem, especially given the shitty rotation of cosmetics into the armory store, and more on that later. Additionally to the lack of grasp that the developers had on what their game should be with the wishes of the community, the base product itself had been hamstrung by bad infrastructure and poor coding implementation. It's been 17 fucking months since the launch of the game, and there still is no team balancer or even a way to manually change teams so that people can do it them goddamn selves, which is critical to a game to maintain healthy servers so they're not more lopsided than Mason Moore's ass implants. Also, to maintain healthy servers, other than generic platitudes and assistance with reporting cheaters, there doesn't seem to be any outward effort to improve the anti-cheat system that DICE is using, as hackers go undetected for what it seems like months, and lobbies are ruined by players that should have easily been banned just by looking at stats pages on Battlefield Tracker. Another thing that was possible to do in previous Battlefield titles with both character and weapon customization during mid-match is now gone, with only a 45-second window in between rounds to make adjustments for the entire duration of the game, which by the way had several iterations of patches before getting it to not kick you out of the menu with each of the several transitions into a new match. I mean, even the specializations and upgrade trees themselves instead of normal attachments makes no goddamn sense. Who the fuck at DICE has a flowchart fetish? Why are we ham-fisted with this awful implementation of stat upgrades where you can only pick between binary or sometimes tertiary choices instead of weapon upgrades that work on different parts of the gun? I mean, for fuck's sake, there's camos that you can unlock for the 6 different parts of a gun. Why not just have attachments that alter those same parts instead of being stuck with just 4 arbitrary gun upgrades? Another Another fun phrase has cropped up in the Battlefield lexicon lately, as when asked about things like weekend events or encouraging players to hop on the game and play with things like double XP or chasing ribbons or medals, the response from the dev team was, quote, "The tech wasn't there." As if they don't sell fucking XP booster packs for the same goddamn game. I know counting isn't DICE's strong suit, but the fact that the ribbon and medal system is so buggy that they had to disable the feature altogether instead of trying to redo the entire system just speaks volumes about how badly the infrastructure of this game is coded. Same goes with the overcomplicated menu system when the devs said they couldn't add in any more playlists because the UI layout literally won't let them put in another tile, or having to completely back out of servers and leave games just to go to the assignments page to change the dangling carrot, or having to go all the way to the company menu to actually have the time to customize your soldiers and weapons, not in the 45 seconds before a fucking match starts, or the armory menu to obtain a new weapon that you just unlocked in the previous game. That is, when it wasn't bugged to fuck, as I'll go into later. Did anybody test this out and give DICE feedback as to how shitty this entire workflow is with regards to interrupting somebody that's playing a game just to grab a reward, which is supposed to be the driving force behind getting players to stay engaged in your game in the fucking first place? The base product itself seems to be held together with some tape and rubber bands, and every once in a while there's a band-aid that comes along in the form of a patch, but they were especially ineffective in this title. Even though the 5.2 update is the most notorious in the life cycle of the game, there are so many other bugs that were injected into the game due to other patches. It was a constant whack-a-mole that the developers were doing from the self-inflicted wounds. In the alpha, it was the squad join feature that didn't work, which is a core fundamental part of the game designed for teamwork. In the beta, it was the death screen and revive animations. The launch of the game was also riddled with bugs, from performance and stability issues to weapons not unlocking after they earned, and even introduced a company coin bug whereby players weren't being rewarded with the grind currency to unlock the new content that DICE actually delivered during the live service, but wasn't fixed until nearly 4 months later after the launch in March. Chapter 2's lightning strikes added in wonky death cam bugs, and even an issue where tanks could just drive in reverse to skip the start of the round countdown and have these vehicles move up to capture points and base rape before the enemy team even had a chance to move. In Chapter 3, Trial by Fire, some nasty new bugs started cropping up again to destroy the gameplay experience, like players appearing to take more than 100 points of damage when shooting at them, and other performance issues like epilepsy-inducing flickering during certain sequences. Chapter 4 was the most notoriously bug-filled set of updates that brought about invisible soldiers, stability in game crashes, strange animations, the couldn't fetch report issues as if DICE was a poorly trained dog, and many more that caused DICE to delay the start of the next chapter by having a 4-week battle fest conveniently at the ready to fill in the Tides of War gap. We already talked about the Chapter 5 fiasco, which is even worse than injecting unintended errors because DICE actively decided to kill its own gameplay, and now Chapter 6 has mostly cleaned up that mess that was self-created, but this last chapter also added in the concept of having weekly rewards being tier skips in the Tides of War progression, which was now the place where weapons were earned via tiers in the Tides of War, versus previously having them as weekly rewards, probably to entice players into purchasing tiers with boins as time goes on, and you feel the crunch of FOMO. But this is another downgrade in game replayability. Why bother coming back for several weeks in a row to complete challenges if I could just ignore the fancy-ass flowchart of assignments to instead just unlock weapons whenever the fuck I please? Bad idea, DICE. Always having 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, and that's for a good patch, is the epitome of the constant letdown with regard to not only updates, but also the Tides of War live service buzzword, which has been an absolute unmitigated disaster in every single way except for adding new weapons into the game, which I do give them credit for because there are a lot of brand new weapons that we got as each chapter went on. Unfortunately, all of the other features and drip-fed content was completely half-assed with piss-poor implementation. Prior to Chapter 5 introducing a new theater of war, which normally is done with other Battlefield games in the first DLC pack, it was done 11 months after launch. There were only 5 full-scale maps that were delivered to add to the paltry 8 launch maps, which is the same amount of DLC maps that Battlefield 1 had after 7 months, which that game itself was ridiculed for the slow amount of DLC progress, and the total number of post-launch maps for Battlefield 5 is now sitting at 9 or 11 if you include the smaller Provence and Lofoten Islands, after a year and a half of the game's life cycle, which is a pathetic cadence for delivering the biggest piece of content that keeps players coming back, especially compared with other Battlefield games, which had at least 3, if not 4, entire DLC packs that contain 4 to 6 maps each, with the previous installment of Battlefield 1 having delivered 16 post-launch maps in the same time frame. It's not just raw numbers here, but also the time duration in between deliverables. Panzerstorm was the first map released in December of 2018, but it wasn't until the end of May of 2019 when we got the second map, Mercury, that's a whole fucking 6 months later. It was followed by Al Sundan at the end of June, but only for Team Deathmatch and Squad Conquest because some of the bugs in the higher population modes like Breakthrough and Conquest, the only ones that Battlefielders actually play, which wouldn't come until the end of September for the map, which the community gave the nickname Al Sundan. Merida was released next month at the end of July, but again, there was a lighting bug on the map which caused certain camos to completely blind the screen when ADSing. This is when the map cadence finally started to pick up a bit, but with almost every single map added into the game, it was left out of certain modes when released, like Panzerstorm being only available for the Conquest mode when it was released in December of 2018 until 3 months later in February when it was finally put into a grand operations with a ROS that included the modes Airborne and Breakthrough, but still to this day, the only other modes on this map are TDM and Domination, which is only half of the modes offered in Battlefield 5. Mercury and Merida were never included in a grand operations together in spite of advertising them as a pair under the Battle of Greece. Al Sundan was relegated to the smaller game modes for 3 whole months, as I mentioned earlier. Operation Underground, along with the 2 Greece maps, only had Breakthrough, Conquest, and Team Deathmatch supported on release. The 2 chapters of the Pacific Front added 4 maps, Iwo Jima and Pacific Storm in November, Wake Island in December, and Solomon Islands in February, 3 of which are either recycled from past titles or partially ripped from them in the case of Pacific Storm, with only having Breakthrough, Conquest, Team Deathmatch, and Squad Conquest available for them on release. Other than the 2 smaller maps, Provence and Lofoten Islands, that were leftovers from an awful 5v5 idea that I'll touch on later, there is one more map that has been announced for the upcoming June patch with Libya, or Al Marj Encampment as the file is named, but it probably also won't be supported in all of the game modes because every single map that has been added to this game is incomplete for the game modes that are currently in it. Speaking of which, DICE has only added in 5 new game modes to Battlefield 5. Well, really 3 brand new and 2 old modes added post-launch. However, in every single instance, they were only available on a subset of maps, like Squad Conquest in February, which started out on only 3 different maps, but eventually, unlike any other mode that's been added to the game, it made its way to all maps except for Panzerstorm and Aerodrome, and has become a permanent addition to the game. Rush, which had been a staple mode in the past, was relegated to limited time status, with it being only officially added outside of community games for a pathetic 6 weeks of the entire life cycle of Battlefield 5, and only appearing on 4 maps at first and ending with 7 maps, or just above half. One of the 3 new modes is called Grind, and it's basically a smaller map. Conquest 64 was only available for 3 fucking weeks in a year and a half, being supported on 4 maps at first, with Operation Underground being included later. Fortress is a slightly altered version of Breakthrough, playable for just 2 weeks on only 2 maps. Outpost finally isn't just a slightly altered implementation of a normal mode, but it was only made for 2 maps at first, with getting 3 more over the course of its minuscule 3-week inclusion. Why were these modes never rotated in and out more consistently over the course of the game's life cycle? Was it seriously because of the UI limitation I mentioned earlier? It makes it even more puzzling when you consider that even though a live service is supposed to add in content as the game goes along, DICE actually pulled the plug on 2 launch modes when it decommissioned both Domination and Frontlines, with the rationale that Squad Conquest made Domination obsolete in spite of it being a worse game mode, and Frontlines was a part of Grand Operations even though it's a shittier version in that mode, which was inferior to the experience in the prior Battlefield game. Yes, DICE actively took away game modes because they weren't that popular and replaced them with a redundant version of the same thing in Squad Conquest and other limited time modes that were only around for 2 months out of the game's life cycle at its best. This isn't how you entice players to come back to a game, by actively taking away core modes and not giving anything in its place. It's been almost 19 minutes and this is the first time I'm even mentioning Firestorm, which itself is a problem, but this Battle Royale mode was delayed until March of 2018, 4 months after launch, which itself was delayed. That I actually thought was a great implementation of the mode. However, having Apex Legends released a month before for free instead of being behind a paywall like Firestorm was, as well as not getting the core elements of a Battle Royale mode correct, like a diarrhea-esque looting system, confusing inventory management, and only having a max player count of 64 players on a huge fucking mungus map, means that after the initial flurry of enjoyment from it being the shiny new thing, this would fall flat in terms of longevity, especially without having a duos mode, with it being relegated to being a limited time thing. Sorry, DICE, but people that want to play duos won't just split up to play solos or rough it out in squads as a team of 2 against teams of 4. They'll just simply go and play another Battle Royale mode that does support duos. When everybody tries to latch on the latest trend, there are going to be some on the outside looking in, and again, the implementation of the Battle Royale mode was half-baked like some soggy brownies, especially after that long of delay after the launch date, meant that Battlefield 5 misses out on the Battle Royale gravy train. To make matters worse, DICE continued to try and reassure the community that they were doing a looting rework after fucking up one of the most important mechanics of a Battle Royale mode and implementing a respawn mechanic into the game, but in September, during a damage control blog post prior to the release of yet another shitty update, DICE indicated that the promises that they made were put on hold, which is the 4th phase of DICE grief. Promised, then delayed, then soon, then reevaluated, then cancelled. To this date, 8 months later, Firestorm still hasn't received any updates in this area, and you wonder why nobody plays this fucking mode. Another feature that was promised during the reveal was a co-op mode called Combined Arms, which wasn't released until February, but was only available on 4 of the 9 maps and was not what was promised at all, since there is no sliding AI scale allowing you to change objectives mid-match, and it launched without any matchmaking, so if you were #forever alone, you were stuck playing a co-op mode by yourself, which sounds like a fucking oxymoron. The game mode was also supposedly made for newer players to the franchise to get them acclimated to the mechanics of the game, but at this point, the game was 3 months old already. Anyone that needed help getting used to the game has had ample enough time to do so by that point. And people aren't going to be picking up this game randomly in the middle of February, so another piss-poor implementation of a feature means time should have been spent elsewhere if this was the offering that they were going to give us. It wasn't until 3 months later in May that finally a matchmaking system was added, as well as the implementation of one more map, Fiel 652, before nothing more was added to an incredibly underwhelming part of the game. Same goes for December of 2018's practice range being added, which was last seen in Battlefield 4, but again, since it was half-assed when it was delivered and still to this date hasn't been updated much, it's a useless feature because you can't even use weapons with your own specialization tree unlocked on them to test out how your actual gun or vehicle will behave, and there's no support for any of the weapons or vehicles that were unlocked via the Tides of War, so it's relegated to only the fucking vanilla weapons. More development time wasted on something as useful as a condom with a hole in it. The rental server program, then rebranded as private games, then rebranded as community games, which only shows you how much layers of bureaucracy that this game has to fucking undertake, was a question mark from the start when Dan Mitri indicated that DICE may not bring the feature into Battlefield 5 at all, which after several blog posts was then slated for September of 2019 after announcing it would be free, but because of how shitty the execution of Chapter 4 went, it was pushed all the way back until December. And then when it did finally launch, it did so in typical DICE fashion, with one design decision completely undermining the entire feature, as you couldn't earn Tides of War XP on these custom servers, and thus making them dead on arrival, because who's going to want to join a server where the progression system, that is one of the core tenets of the game, doesn't accrue your time played on these servers? According to that End of Future Content blog post, there will be updates in this area, but again, if you do shit right the first time, then you don't have to spend extra resources chasing finishing incomplete features, and instead can actually make your game better or work on brand new content. Players that threw down extra money for a deluxe edition never really were informed of what their extra money would get them, which is kind of a dumb idea on the part of the purchasers, but DICE certainly didn't make things any better for those more ardent fans of the franchise when the airlift items that they did eventually get were individually tallied by making each piece of a full cosmetic set count as one item towards their weekly 20, meaning instead of a full weapon skin being one airlift, it counted as, let's say, 5, with the muzzle, grip, stock, barrel, and sight being split up into 5 different pieces and doled out over the course of 5 weeks instead of all at once, in a weasel move that no doubtably infuriated customers that paid extra. This isn't the first time that DICE has pulled the wool over the eyes of its fans by shutting off Middle Eastern and South African servers recently and rerouting them to European servers during a motherfucking pandemic, after encouraging players to, quote, stay safe, stay home, play together on the battlefield, with the same rationale of a low player population from the front lines and domination excuse, only to turn them back on after getting shit from the community about how big of hypocritical fucks they are. Another instance of this happened after first dropping the battlefield currency derisively called boins in April. There were soldier outfits in the armory that were not available to be purchased with the grind online currency company coin, but only the real-world money currency Boins, in spite of the misleading screenshot during the announcement that's yet another fucking flow diagram. It appeared that all cosmetics could be purchased with either Boins or company coin, but that just simply isn't the case. Later on in the chapter, another Boins controversy arose when an outfit called Pit Crew that was previously available for company coin was then reclassified as Epic, thus it would be only purchasable with Boins or actual money, not with company coin. Instead of doing the right thing by changing it to be company coin again, DICE doubled down on that bad decision, stating that the original classification was wrong and that they, quote, fixed the glitch, as if we're in fucking Office Space now. That's not the way to go about nickel and diming your customer base, especially after misleading customers about how the microtransaction system worked in the fucking first place. It's too bad that they didn't reverse course on this explanation, basically telling us to eat shit when we called them out on their shady monetization practices. This breaking promises thing and constantly delaying features or updates is also a recurring theme in Battlefield 5, with vehicle customization that came in the form of paint jobs during early December of 2018, but actually getting to modify things like your tank turret and chassis, which was announced during reveal, finally arrived in March of 2020, nearly 15 months later. A rank increase from 50, which was achieved by many within the first month or so of the game launching, was finally up to a stupidly too much compensated the other way 500 in September, 10 months later. Content shown off in trailers like Elites in Chapter 2, not releasing until Chapter 3, 12 weeks later, and items in the Chapter 4 trailer, which weren't until Chapter 5 or 6, or sometimes even not at all in certain cases. A 5v5 mode was cancelled in September when those two other maps were released, Provence and Lofoten Islands, only for small modes like Team Deathmatch and Squad Conquest, although it's clear due to data mines that it had been worked on for about 6 months prior to having its plug pulled. The fact that DICE wasted so many resources on a competitive type mode that wasn't ready when the game launched, and the lack of lessons learned from incursions in Battlefield 1 that a completely different variant of the base game from an esports perspective is a horrific idea, makes me scratch my head as to why they thought this small scale mode was even iterated upon in the first place. If you want your game to make waves in esports, keep it as similar as possible to the normal public game to generate interest, and don't do it nearly 9 months after the game launch, because interest and hype is never going to be higher than launch date. There were so many beepity bops that were made for this game mode that have still never been released due to them not having the same level of detail with regards to specializations and assignments, even though the assignments in this game, who the fuck created them? Some of them are excruciatingly difficult, and some force you to play in a gameplay style which runs contradictory to the design philosophy that DICE themselves has been pushing with this game. So you might as well release these weapons without assignments and people might actually be grateful for it. It's just infuriating knowing that there are resources allocated to making this mode that is almost completely decoupled from the actual game, that it would have been a disaster either way for DICE, but it's far worse that it was cancelled and these assets have still been unreleased as a result. DICE has improved certain game modes as time has gone along with Frontlines and Rush, although why they had to be taken out in order to do so is fucking beyond me, as if them being in an imperfect state was somehow now unacceptable after they had basically filled their entire game with everything else being done in the same manner. But even though feedback was solicited via surveys and Reddit posts, Grand Operations never got any alterations. Instead, the quote flagship mode of the game was such a shitty implementation from the start. The outcome of the first two matches doesn't matter, as it's only the third that counts for which side won or lost the entire Grand Operations, and in a lot of cases the third round was a shitty variant of Frontlines that was completely lopsided towards whichever team captured the central objective because of the way the maps were laid out. And who the fuck knew what the crazy conditions were for actually getting the fourth round Final Stand, which I played maybe twice or three times in the entirety of my playtime. The whole Grand Operations was just a complete clusterfuck of a mode. In addition, the lack of atmospheric cutscenes or even sound effects during the game itself really makes playing the 3-round match set a giant fucking chore. Other cut features include soldier dragging and plane crash landing, which the latter was included in the reveal trailer because apparently these animations were just too much in a game that was already full of immersion breaking ones for doing every little fucking thing. Outside of the game, the community managers would constantly be stringing people along on Reddit to pledge that they would talk to the development team about something, and we'd never hear a fucking peep back about these supposed interactions on the feedback that we gave them. I understand as a developer myself that they really wanted to try to do all of the things on their Trello board because they realize that there's so much shit wrong with this game that needs fixing, but as the saying goes, show, don't tell. Saying Firestorm improvements are coming for months on end before putting them on indefinite hiatus, the constant moving of goalposts all the time when it comes to actually putting shit in your game that will sustain a player base, and the radio silence after hearing that there will be more communication and the same fucking issues every goddamn time that gets repetitively posted on the every 7-day cadence this week in Battlefield threads without resolution or some form of guidance eroded all of the goodwill that DICE had with the community in this game. In a video that I made before the launch of the game, I detailed why I was skeptical and worried about the live service model of the Tides of War, given EA and DICE's own track record, and it's mostly rung true, except now somehow Star Wars Battlefront 2 has made strides, yet Battlefield 5 floundered, and it's developed by the same fucking team. The words of the general manager of DICE, Oscar Gabrielson, is just a flat-out fucking lie now when saying on Twitter back in the end of August that you could trust us to get Battlefield back on track because of our work on Star Wars Battlefront 2. Is it perhaps because EA was trying to salvage the Disney exclusivity money for the Star Wars franchise and put their supposed flagship game on the back burner, even when DICE claimed that Battlefield was always their first priority? I could definitely see that, considering that EA probably also pushed them to put out Battlefield 5 before it was ready to get holiday revenue, which coincidentally also probably led them to the less than expected sales figures for the game when you've got to sell it at a discount because of holiday markdowns. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely some blame that we could put on EA here with forcing DICE to release games every single year from 2015 through 2018, which is when Battlefield 5 launched, and it definitely caused a burnout amongst the team. It's obvious that this game broke the studio itself with how many senior members at DICE just up and left the team during this game's life cycle, which does slightly concern me about the product going forward. But realistically, DICE are the ones that put this game into a self-destruction sequence that it was never able to break out of by consistently letting the players down with half-baked new content and making terrible development decisions that handcuffed the team, trying to make new shit for the game by not only allocating resources to bad ideas and wasting their efforts, but also with not having the tech to make the game extendable in areas that should be easy for enhancements. Now, this isn't to say I favor the premium model because free DLC is better than splitting the community via paid DLC, even if it's in smaller scope. The live service problem isn't one of not having the monetary resources to fill the gaps, which would have been satisfied via a premium model, but instead the ineptitude of DICE to make decisions and understand what their game is supposed to be in the experience of its player base, as well as half-assing any content that could be released during the launch of the game itself. The thing that people don't get about a live service model is that by having to fix bugs and other things that crop up during your game that inevitably will happen, you undercut into the time that you could be making new content to fill out the empty game that you shipped with. So you're constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul, and that's never a good idea in terms of game development. I'm really hoping that the June update will finally release a Russian faction to the game, but that's probably far too optimistic given the track record of development. It makes sense as to why there's so much iconic World War II weaponry that's not in the game yet, because DICE was probably saving it for a Russian faction, similar to the way the US and Japanese factions were introduced with their iconic weaponry. There was a 5 or so week period after the launch of Chapter 5 and before that asinine 5.2 update that Battlefield 5 felt like a great game that had an immersive World War II sandbox experience without any major game-crippling bugs getting in the way of our enjoyment that we had hoped for prior to the launch trailer blowing that pipe dream all to shit. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed the other parts of the game, but there was always some bullshit getting in the way, whether it be game-breaking bugs or the half-assed delivery of new things to the game. But with the war in the Pacific, it seemed like DICE had finally delivered on a vision that the community wanted and didn't trip over themselves by fucking shit up until they had to go and make a mistake that they already made a year beforehand. There is a good game in here, and that's what makes this whole saga so frustrating. But now, after this announcement, even though I didn't have very many expectations or even any expectations about DICE making enhancements to the game, I can put all that bullshit behind me and just play the game as it is without the what-ifs or hopes on the horizon. It's very strange to now pull the plug when the next Battlefield title isn't coming out until 2021 and probably the latter half of the year, which is 18 months away, considering that there was still content being put into other Battlefield titles even after the next installment of the franchise was revealed. But this is probably a blessing in disguise. The next Battlefield game cannot be the shit show that was this game. Giving DICE time to develop it correctly is better than having to resuscitate something that DICE has been accidentally killing since prior to it even launching. The goodwill of the community for DICE has evaporated at this point, so the next Battlefield title must get it right from the very start, because fans are not going to put up with this shit for yet another game. Anyways, I know this has been a really long video, but I wanted to detail the exact pain and frustration that I've gone through as a Battlefield fan with this game, and to point out just the sheer ineptitude of the developers with all of the different things that have happened along the way. What do you think of the announcement of the end of content in June? As it comes a bit of a shock, but again, now at least the expectations of nothing are set instead of the lip service that's been going on from the community managers regarding no info to share or DICE's favorite four-letter word, soon. I've been DoshSwans27, off like a prom dress, except there's no proms this year. Sorry about that. Until next time.